Hello and welcome to Communication School. My name is Isaiah Allen. I am NAGC's Executive Director. Let me welcome you to the first breakout session. The breakout session that you are in is Anyone Listening? Will be presented by Tom Fuller. I know Tom best as one of the directors on NAGC's board of directors. So I have the pleasure of working with Tom in that capacity and appreciate his volunteer service to NAGC in that setting. If you have questions as Tom gives this presentation, if you would like to add those to the Q&A, I will sort through those at the end and relay those to Tom so that he can give some feedback as we reach the end of the session. So we'll save a little bit of time for that at the end of the session. But Tom, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thanks Isaiah, and back at you. I enjoy working with you as well. I am, as Isaiah mentioned, the Director for Professional Development here at NAGC, and my day job is as the Communications Manager for the Oregon Department of Transportation. And I'm a 20-year television news veteran, and I've spent another 20 years in state service with the Oregon Employment Department, and then just in the last 7 years with the Oregon Department of Transportation. Last year in 2020, I got my APR, my Accreditation in Public Relations, and have become very passionate around good, best practice use of the discipline of public relations and communications. So I do a fair amount of teaching, both for NAGC and for other organizations as well, in terms of research planning, implementation, and evaluation, and some of the things that I've implemented at the Oregon Department of Transportation I speak about as well. So today we are going to ask a very vital question about our communication products. Is anybody actually listening? So to begin with, I want to share a very famous quote. Alan Greenspan, former chair of the Federal Reserve, said something that encapsulates the essence of what I want to talk about today, the miscommunication between sender and receiver. And Alan said, "I know you think you understand what you thought I said, but I'm not sure you realize that what you heard is not what I meant." Our audience hears something, but it turns out to be not what we said or even what we meant. This mismatch is one of the chief reasons that our communication sometimes can fall on deaf ears. Now let's change that. So first, let's see where we're going, and then we'll walk through the presentation today. So these are the 4 steps that I'm going to bring you to encourage a listening audience. Tweak your audience's receptivity, use the right channel correctly, increase engagement thoughtfully, and listen to the audience carefully. But before we get there, let me set the stage a little bit. Let's talk about the roadblocks or the barriers to communication. The first roadblock that I want to talk about of the 7 roadblocks is overload. Now, in the 1970s, we encountered between 500 and 1,200 messages a day. By 2007, that number had increased to about 5,000 messages per day. And by 2021, we experience as individuals up to 10,000 messages every day, double the amount just back in 2007. In fact, Fakhar Naveed, a communications researcher from Pakistan, said that we're not so much information handlers as we are information avoiders. Overload, it's a huge problem. They might not even be there. If you send your message over a channel your audience isn't tuned into, then it's kind of like a tree falling in the forest when nobody's around. It doesn't actually make a sound. Preconceptions. Their preconceptions of you might get in the way. They influence whether or not the audience is even going to listen to you. In fact, the social learning theory tells us that people will tend to listen to messages that are already in sync with their beliefs and their attitudes. So if your message is not in sync, they will tend to tune you out before they even start to listen. perhaps you're not speaking their language. And I don't mean you're speaking in Arabic when you meant to speak in English or something like that. If you use fuzzy, non-relevant, or technical language, it won't even make it through the noise filter. We'll have a lot more to say on that coming up. Fourth, there may be a credibility problem. If there's a history of problems or distrust between you and your audience, then the lack of credibility will also make them less likely to even start listening to your message. And as you probably know, as a government communicator, when people think about government, they tend to lump local, county, state, and federal governments all together into one. So you get to experience the credibility gap that may have been caused by somebody else. Distractions. Remember I said those 10,000 messages in a day, plus all the social media that your audience is trying to stay abreast of. No wonder that you're having a problem getting their attention. Others may actually have gotten there first and poisoned the well. Negative influencers can get there ahead of your message, and they can give it a negative spin before you even had a chance. Now, I've experienced that myself with the Oregon Department of Transportation and a large project that we're working on where negative influencers got in there and made all kinds of statements, and they poisoned the well toward the message that we were trying to bring. So why is this so complicated? I mean, honestly, can't just a good, well-crafted message make it through and influence your audience? Well, the answer is it's complicated, all right. And to understand a little bit of why it's so complicated, we need to understand how communication works in the real world. And to do that, we refer to the famous communication theoretician, Wilbur Schramm. Now, Wilbur Schramm's model of communication says that every messenger, message, channel, context, and receiver affects message reception and retention. So here's a simplified model of how it works. Both the sender and the receiver start out with a field of experience, what you know, what you believe, what you desire, and all the things that have sort of happened to you. Add to that a social environment for each sender and receiver, influences that are between the sender and the receiver. Now, it might be a minimal kind of relationship, but like I mentioned with the idea of preconceptions, it might be a negative social environment. In the center is where communication takes place. We call this the communication zone. And you can already see by what we've talked about that the waters are already muddied before any messages get sent. So you, as the sender, encode a message, you send it across a channel, and if you are, as the first sort of problem with the communication model, if you are using a certain type of language, maybe it's filled with buzzwords or jargon, or it's just a poorly constructed sentence, then when the message is trying to get over the channel to be decoded by the receiver, it's going to just bounce right back. They're not going to even hear it. It's just going to sound like Charlie Brown and the teacher, wah, 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 wah. So you really need to pay attention to the language. And I'm going to talk a lot about that as we go on through this, because I'm a really big believer in using language that's appropriate. There's another thing that will interfere with the decoding of the message, and that is noise and interference. So noise and interference colors your message. So you sent it as a gray message, but noise and interference actually change it into green so that it's not decoded properly. And then eventually you find out that information when you try to ask your audience, well, what was the message that you heard? That's the feedback loop. So anyway, not going to get more into Schramm's model, but I just wanted to show you and give you a sense that communications is very complicated. It's not just about crafting some good words. You really have to take much more into account if you want to be heard. So what does being heard actually mean anyway? Well, to understand that, we need to go back and look at what are your goals. So what does being heard actually mean? In terms of public relations, we speak of knowledge gain, opinion change, attitude change, and then hopefully actually behavior change. Now, for the purposes of our talk today, I want to submit 4 other ways of looking at the goals. When it comes to creating a listening audience, you want to get their attention. Then you want them to react. You want to see that the message not only got their attention, but it got them to actually react to it. And then you want them to retain that message that you have given, and then hopefully at the end, actually take some action. So we talked a little bit now about the barriers to communication, the communication model, and then how we think about the goals that we want to set in terms of what is success. So how do we do this? Well, let's go through step 1. And step 1 is to tweak your audience's receptivity. And to do that, I have the 3 most important words in this presentation. Are you ready? Drum roll, please. You need to know thy audience. And I don't mean just know them as the amorphous blob of humanity, the so-called general public. I wish that were banned from the lexicon, because there is no such thing as the general public. Every audience has something about them. We're going to talk more about that, that sets them apart from others. When you do that general public sort of communication, I think it's kind of lazy. You don't really want to go to the work of understanding your audience, but our audience is made up of individuals. Let's hear what Seth Godin says about that, who's one of my favorite bloggers. And he wrote this just really short blog post about a week ago, wholesale versus retail. And he said, up close, face to face, in the specific, it's difficult to dismiss the humanity of others. It's only when we decide to industrialize the process, to do it all at once, to boil it down to numbers, that's when we disconnect, one at a time, because it might feel like a slog to you, but it matters to them. So it matters if you try to get as specific as you can. Honestly, your audience should feel like you're speaking directly and only to them. That's how you begin to break through the noise and the interference between the sender and the receiver. You need to define the audience, in other words. We need to define them as specifically as we can. You may have heard a term before called personas. This is kind of what I'm getting to a little bit, which are fictional representations of the makeup, the demographics, and the psychology, the psychographics of your audience. Now, in the following slides, I'm going to illustrate what kinds of information you need to learn about your audience in order to understand who you are speaking to. And first, we need to know what are their core concerns, values, and needs. Are they concerned about clean air or free speech? Do they value social engagement or just getting stuff done? Do they need peace or do they need energizing? This knowledge can help you to meet them where they are. Again, make them feel like you're speaking just to them. So in short, you need to get into the mind of your audience. How do they think? What motivates them? So secondly, you need to understand how they obtain their information. Are they old school newspaper readers? Do they watch the evening news? Do they get most of their information from friends? Third, what barriers stand in the way of a decision? And that's, in this case, the decision to listen, then the decision to believe, and then the decision to act on those beliefs. Do you know things about your audience that can tell you this? Now, it might be, as we looked at the barriers before, it might be that there's been a prior bad experience with government. They don't trust an agency. So that tells you you need a different way of approaching them, knowing that there are barriers there. But if you don't know they're there, you're likely to run right into them. Now, not only do we need to understand the barriers, we also need to understand how we can merge with their background, their psychology, their needs, wants, concerns, and desires. So I'll give you an example from a campaign that we did a few years back. So starting in 2016, we noticed a sharp rise in traffic fatalities in Oregon. And there wasn't any specific cause. There wasn't anything that we could just tie to and say, it was the weather or it was a bad design of the roadway or anything like that. So my director at the time charged me with coming up with a campaign to try and address whatever this problem was, a communication campaign. And so we just did some research, and I discovered that there was a correlation between the ownership of smartphones and the increase in traffic fatalities. So we went back to the traffic data, and we discovered that the common denominator in the increase in fatalities was what we call road departure. So they left their lane of travel and either crashed into somebody in the opposite lane or went off the side of the road. So we did some more research, and we surmised then that lane departure was caused by distractions because people had their smartphones in the car with them. So distracted driving. Now, our research also found that despite many public relations campaigns, the incidence of distracted driving continued. So we had to come up with an approach that got beyond the filters. So people had preconceptions, and those were keeping the message from getting through. We had to get into the hearts and minds of our audiences. So one of the audiences that we had were teenage boys. And we found that teenage boys were particularly immune from public service type of pleas. There's actual research that's been done that shows that. So we needed to find another way in. So digging further, a research study found that coupling public service messages with gameplay made a difference in teenage boys' retention and adoption of public service pleas. So one of the tactics that we used then was to create a smartphone app that gave you immediate feedback on how you drove and whether you were driving distracted, and then also entered you into a contest. That's where the gameplay came in, to compete to see who was Oregon's safest driver. So I hope this shows you a little bit about defining your audience, knowing their demographics and their psychographics can help you change or adopt or adapt a focus that will hopefully get through. Okay, so next, you need to understand who influences your audience. Who do they listen to already? This is another way to break through those filters, because this person is going to be a trusted individual. Now, we are in the midst of doing a campaign to try and get Oregonians to get a real ID. This is something that's going on nationwide. Originally, in October of last year, was a deadline where you had to have a real ID compliant form of identification to make it through TSA security at the airport. That, of course, changed. It changed our campaign, et cetera. But when we were doing that original campaign, we needed to find an influencer that Oregonians would listen to. And so we asked Oregon's governor, Kate Brown, if she would do public service announcements for us, because we needed to create a feeling of importance and urgency. So what better influencer than the governor of our state? And she graciously agreed to appear in our public service announcements. All right, next, you need to find out whether you have any connections to this particular audience. Might be a shared interest in fly fishing, or the Rotary Club, or a school, or maybe your organization is part of a group that also includes members of your audience. So this all leads me to two related concepts that I hope you take away with you from this presentation. And those concepts are WSIC and WIFM. Probably the only acronyms I will use. I generally dislike acronyms, and when you give me an acronym, I generally try to make up a silly way of defining it, because I think acronyms become that jargon that people just bounce off people. But we're all in the same audience. We're communication professionals from various government levels. And so I think you could probably stand a couple of acronyms. So what do they mean? What's WSIC and WIFM? So WSIC is why should I care? You have to make your audience care about the communication, or they're not going to listen at all. And then further and related, you need to give them something as a benefit. What's in it for me? I used to work in television news, as I said, and we had this kind of filter going on every single day, because we would get bombarded with story ideas. And if we couldn't see, why should I care about this? And what's in it for the audience? What's in it for our viewers? Then we wouldn't do the story. It would just go into the slush pile. So if you can't articulate what the WSIC and WIFM is in your message, it won't likely get through. Now, you're asking, how do I find out all this stuff? Well, here's some, excuse me, here's some ideas. Surveys. You can do your own. I do a lot of surveys. You need to be kind of clever about them and make them fun, make them short. You may have surveys that have already been done by your organization. We have one that's done every 2 years. It's called the Transportation Needs and Interests Survey. You can also look at national polls that have been done and published. That can give you some demographic and psychographic information. If you belong to PRSA, they have a case study library that can be very valuable in looking at different personas. You can look at your social media. If you do any social media advertising, there are incredible ways to understand your audience and to drive down deep and see what their psychographics are like. That is a huge tool right there. Maybe there's some past campaigns that have been done by your organization that have included audience research. We've reused all kinds of audience research. You can use your email lists if you have like GovDelivery or something else that shows you things like the open rate. If they're segmented, let's say, into an interest group, and then you can look at their open rate, that can give you some information as well. And finally, one of the big things that I like is focus groups. Now, it's qualitative, it's not quantitative data, but it can really help you in diving into those psychographics of your audience. And then it also can help you when you want to test the messages that you're sending to the audience. So let me show you an example of the audience research that one of my staff did for a communication campaign we're currently running internally and externally around a new strategic action plan. And so we went through as a communications group and we identified target audiences that will need to receive messages because we want to take them from awareness to knowledge to attitude to behavior when it comes to this strategic action plan. But you can see that this is a very detailed list. We start with the target audience generally, and then we get very specific as far as what's the makeup of that audience. And then we talk about their strengths in coming into the communication stream. We talk about the weaknesses that they have, like information overload is one of the ones that we identified. And then what are the opportunities? What are the things already in our favor? Like for staff, they're a captive audience. But what are the threats that are also existing? And basically that some of our staff are the strongest naysayers. So we have to be careful of that. We need to know what motivates them. If we're going to try and come alongside, merge our needs, wants, and desires with them, then we need to know what motivates them. And being in the know is a high value of our staff. And then what are their pain points? They feel disengaged. They might disagree on the goals in the strategic action plan. So all of this provides a framework that we use when we're going to target the employee audience. We need to look across all these things, and it helps us to develop our communication tactics and the approach that we use. And how do we get these? All those things I just mentioned were used. And some of the surveys that have been done, engagement surveys, we've done our own surveys. We did a large staff survey last summer. So that's where we're getting a lot of this information. But that's an example of what you can do. Okay, so now let's turn to step 2, and that is to use the right channel correctly. You need to pick the right method, but you also need to use it properly. Like, you can't just copy and paste a press release over Twitter. That just doesn't work. So there are 4 considerations that you need to use when you are thinking about the method that you're going to choose. And that is the sender, the message, the channel, and the receiver. So first, the sender. And there are 2 things that I would suggest to you when you're thinking about who's going to send the message. One is choose someone that your audience can relate to. Like if you're doing something on farming, wouldn't that be great if you could have a farmer? Or you can choose somebody that your audience respects. And this is where that idea of influencers that I mentioned earlier can come to play. Who delivers your message is very important. And if you can get someone to deliver it that already influences your audience, your message is much more likely to be received. So let's now talk about the message itself. And I want to highlight 2 key elements of the message. the text and the treatment. And I want you to ask yourself a very important question. What do you want the audience to feel? What do you, yeah, now we would go, no, I want to tell them what to think. Well, no, you actually want them to feel something. And you say, but we want them to make a decision. We want them to use logic and see that they really need to respond to our message because this is vital for them and they need to use their brains. Well, yeah, yes and no. I know it sounds weird, but there was a study that was done that showed that even rational, logical decisions are actually made through emotion. It's how we feel about the rational decision that we are making. So in its core, what you really want to do is give a feeling to your audience. Now, as far as the text itself, I would ask that you do two things, and one is to remove what I call stop words. Stop words are those that hang your audience up. Remember back to when we were talking about being lazy about receiving messages. We're not information handlers, but information avoiders. If you, through language, create any kind of friction, chances are your audience will just move on instantly. And we'll have more on to say on that in just a moment. So remove those stop words, those words that make your audience have to think. But I want you to include what I call go words. And go words, sorry, I'm going to step back a slide here. Go words are those that show the benefit, the WISIC and the WIFM. And if the audience knows you speak their language, then they are going to be more readily available and actively listening. So the text itself, there are two things to pay attention to, and that is the length and the language. So I want to talk about our Real ID campaign again for a moment. I want you to ask yourself, whenever you're putting a message on a channel, how much time do you have to spend with that audience? Now, what you're seeing in front of you overlaid on some monitors is a real example of the initial proposal for some text we were going to do for our Real ID campaign. Now, what's happening here is that passengers are getting on an escalator and going down to baggage claim. So by the time they wrestle their carry-on into the escalator next to them, they get themselves settled, they look up and they're thinking, what carousel did the airline say my baggage is coming out on? Oh yeah, it's carousel 5. Then they're looking at this monitor in front of them. So you literally only have seconds in order to give them a message. And so how likely do you think that it is that they're going to read all the text on that screen for the few seconds that you have of their attention when they're going down the escalator? The shorter the message, basically, the more likely that it is for them to get through. So what I want to show you now is when we took that length of time into consideration, this is what we proposed to put on those monitors. Very, very few words. This is like a billboard, and a billboard, if you have like 8 words or, so, that's about all that you have. And I always chuckle every time I go by a billboard where they've stuck all this stuff on here and all this fine print, What's the point? Nobody's going to have time. And if they do, then they're driving distracted. So, watch out. Believe it or not, there's a whole science around the length of messages. And I think in the notes section of this PowerPoint, which you can get from the Whova app, I have links to a lot of things in the notes, a lot of the background for the things that I'm saying here today. But there's a whole science on how long you have with people. You get a whopping 3 minutes on YouTube, believe it or not, but you only get about 71 characters on Twitter. They even have the optimal length of a headline, which is 6 words. Who knew? Okay, so that's a little bit about the text. Now let's talk about the length, excuse me. Now let's talk about the language itself. I love this little comic. Now these people are both saying the same thing, but while one fills the air with 16 words of buzz, the guy on the right, just with 7 words, says, I just kind of wanted to eat. So kind of a silly example, but who will be understood the best? That's where we talk about jargon versus plain language. And plain language itself has almost become something that folks who are program analysts think they understand. And so they kind of throw that back in your face. So sometimes I like to say clear language. But it matters. Whoops. It matters. If you say, we're going to use a vehicle appearance operative, those are stop words, and the audience will go, wait, what? Vehicle appearance operative? But if you just said, a car washer, oh, okay, I know what that is. And I love this one, the Career Alternative Enhancement Program, otherwise known as you're fired. So use their language. And it isn't just about the language in your main message. It's really important because we need to hook the audience, that we bring them along with us on sort of a journey. In public relations theory, this is the use of signs, symbols, and images that are common experiences between the sender and the receiver. Remember, I talked about merging. That's where this comes into play. So riding a bike on a crisp fall day, cute puppies. This is one of my dogs, by the way, Ellie. Taking a walk with friends or laughing over a good meal. These are all things that can be shared experiences or images or symbols that we have together with our audience. And if you start with those shared experiences and emotions, then you can encourage the audience to take another step with you, to go the rest of the way with you on this journey. So let's look at an example. So this is, I call this a tale of two texts. The first text is right out of a report that was done on a road usage charging program that we at the Oregon Department of Transportation have put into place. And it is filled with a lot of jargon. It is focused on the program, and it's all about the program and the agency and the detailed descriptions about the system itself. Whereas the text on the right is focused from the customer's point of view, and it connects with common emotions and themes of the audience. We all love getting out on the open road. And then it shows the connection to the need that the audience knows that they have to keep their cars tuned up and maintained in order to be able to go out on the open road when they want to. But we apply that analogy to the road. Well, the road needs maintenance too, right? So I really feel like the number two example is going to be much more likely to be received by the audience. So now we talk about the treatment. And we start with what formats your audience likes: videos, audio, blogs, maybe posts, maybe they like ads. Each format that you choose takes a different treatment. Now, your message might actually go over multiple channels, but you need to pay attention to what the treatment that you need to use on those channels, because if you don't tailor it, you won't be able to engage your audience. So what do I mean? So treatment includes the idea of what's called production design. College students, speaking to college students, maybe it's an animated video, maybe it's a strong image that covers that fronts a short article. And so here's where you decide, what is your production design going to be? And is it going to be humorous? Is it going to be serious, scary, self-referential, sweet, and the like? Every movie and TV show has a production designer. Their job is to set the visual tone for the production, and you need to be the production designer for your messages as well. Let me show you a real example. Now, here's a production design we did during a Tolkien reading day. It is humorous. It uses a classic but known piece of literature, that is J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. So that's the common images, common symbols, and then it ties that character Gollum, who you can see here, to a calendar event. And we did it in a cartoonish way, but we inserted a safety message in hopefully a clever way. So that's what I kind of mean by production design. So let's go back to that road usage program that I shared the text about. It's really not the treatment at all. Those were just some words to kind of show the difference in language. The treatment that we used, one of the channels that we sent this over, our message, to support a road usage program, which is called Origo, by the way. It's a new tax. You pay by the mile you drive rather than the gallon you buy at the pump. And I don't know about you, but getting people to volunteer to pay a new tax, yeah, about that. Not so much. That's a hard pass. So you can see the difficult communication challenge that we faced. And so what we did was used common emotions and themes and some text to create a video. And so I'm going to play the video. I hope, cross my fingers, that it will play okay. And as you watch, ask yourself, is this video about a new tax, or is it about people and lovely places? What you'll see is that we wrapped common symbols of family, fun, the open road, and freedom with information about a revolutionary new way to fund the roads. Let's watch.
Oregon's natural landscape is as diverse as the people who live here, and we like that. We like that we can pack up the car and head out for a weekend on the coast, or for business in the city. When you stop to think about it, our roads really do keep us connected.
But the reality is, many of us don't think about how we preserve and maintain the roads that get us where we need to go. Oregonians contribute to state road and bridge projects at the pump, 34 cents per gallon of fuel. But now, vehicles use less gas than ever before, and many run on electricity. Less gas equals less money for roads. So what does this mean for the future of our state?
In true Oregon fashion, we're pioneering new ways to fund our roads. Like Origo, the nation's first road usage charge program. Origo allows drivers to pay per mile driven instead of per gallon of gas. Oregonians said a pay-per-mile system is fair because everyone pays for what they drive, and they liked that. They like that it will help keep our roads and bridges around for future generations, so they can enjoy this amazing state too.
Find out how to keep Oregon connected at myorigo.org/connected.
All right, so you can
Oregon's
see,
natural landscape is as diverse.
you can see that it's starting over again. So that's an advanced treatment, but I think you get the idea of where I'm going. Okay, so we talked about the sender and the message. Now let's talk about the channel a little bit. As I mentioned, there can be multiple channels. Your audience might tune into a network news. They might get information on Facebook. They might like Instagram, terrestrial radio, even print. And when you're looking at your channel, you need to look at things like the length, the tone, the type of channel it is, the style that you want to address, the design then of how you design your message, some of the things that we've already talked about. So now let's go on to the receiver. And there are two tips that I want to give you in order to create a memorable communication. Remember, communication is about not about the program. It's about the relationship between sender and receiver. Now, as Wilbur Schramm says, there is no meaning in a message except what people in the communication relationship put into it. So when you consider your communication plan, think about your relationship to the audience, the context or frames of reference of that relationship, and what will likely get their attention and move them emotionally. All right, now let's go on to increasing engagement thoughtfully. This is where we get into that idea of active listening. That's getting that reaction. How do you do that? You want to make your message relatable, short, simple, and easy. First, make it relatable. And one of the most effective ways of doing that is to tell a story. A story becomes relatable when the listeners can picture themselves in that situation. Think about your message. Can your audience relate, or maybe just your stakeholders? And I'm doing another talk, I think it's actually later today, on strategic storytelling, where we get a lot more in depth into what this idea of storytelling is. Make it brief. Millward Brown determined that having an ad with just 4 messages, and you think about the number of messages in your communication, it reduces the likelihood of your audience remembering even one of them to only 43%. And the percentage of those who will remember all four is less than a quarter. So make it brief, make it simple. The Corporate Executive Board surveyed 7,000 marketing executives, and they looked at 40 different variables impacting whether someone would remember a message. They called it, was it sticky? This is cool. The only variable that made a difference was what they called decision simplicity. And they defined that as the ease with which consumers can gather trustworthy information about a product and confidently and efficiently weigh their purchase options. Now, I know as government communicators, we don't usually have people buy things unless it's a tax or a permit fee or something like that. But the purchase can also be agreement or taking some action associated with a change in attitude. So the easier that they understand what decision you want to make, why and how they can do it, the more likely they are to engage. And then finally, make it easy. Wilbur Schramm, back to good old Wilbur Schramm, he created what's called the fraction of selection formula to help figure out how much stuff that we see will actually get read. And the formula is reward divided by effort required. So simple calls to action, uncomplicated explanations will do better every time than trying to cram everything into your message. All right, then finally we come to that feedback loop, listening to the listeners. And the question we have to ask, and again, the topic of this entire talk this morning is anybody listening? How do you know if they're listening? Well, there are several mechanisms that you can employ. I've talked about some of these already with audience research. You can ask your audience to take a post-message survey. You can do their focus groups, both pre and post-message. You can give them somewhere to go, like a web page, and then you use like an urchin tracking campaign in order to see where they are headed and where they came from. That can give you an idea of their path and give you some feedback on, oh, the message got through. They went to the page. That's like with our Oregon.gov/RealID. If they actually came to the page, we know that they were getting the message. You can do observations. Observational studies are really, really good if you can do them. And ultimately, of course, you judge by their attitude and their behavior change. So those are the four paths to audience attention and retention and engagement. And I have just one final thought before we open it up briefly to questions. And that is from one of my favorite people, Anne Wiley. She said, just give targets entertaining information they can use to live their lives better that also promotes our products, programs, plans, and positions. And I hope you saw some of the examples that I use. We did that. We entertained, but we provided information that would benefit their lives, whether it's just giving them a little laugh or talking about connections with people. But at the same time, it also promotes what we're doing as an agency. So that is my presentation. And Isaiah, if we have any questions, go ahead. We've got about 7 minutes to go here, I think.
Yeah, there's a couple questions for you, Tom. The first one here, we utilize email as a major comms channel. So do marketers and spammers and social media sites and family and hundreds of others trying to reach the same audience. Any tips on cutting through the message clutter?
Sure, absolutely. First of all, if you are not using GovDelivery and you're a government organization, you need to. Fantastic organization, and they get on whitelists, so they will bypass a lot of the spam filters. Another thing you need to do is to do a lot of research on your subject line. The subject line is going to either entice your audience or they're going to go away. Use pictures in your emails. Pictures, visuals, increase engagement exponentially. Also be very aware of breaking up your text with white space. Don't just throw a bunch of text, big long paragraphs at people. What you need, it's that fraction of selection, right? What's the reward over the amount of time and effort I'm going to have to use to get it? So short messages, some of the same stuff that we've talked about here. Also with GovDeliver, you can segment your audience. So you give them more what they want by allowing them to sign up for special interest groups, lists, and things like that. So that's a little bit on that.
Very good. Another question here. We are always trying to improve audience engagement over Zoom. I'm thinking probably particularly as a lot of government meetings are happening over Zoom, even public-facing government meetings. We rely on Zoom polls and Q&A features to gauge engagement. Do you have other suggestions? I believe other suggestions for gauging engagement through Zoom.
Yeah, polls and surveys are fine. I think that the giving them somewhere to go, a little tidbit I left out earlier, this idea of message simplicity also has kind of a corollary, and that is you can let your audience go as deep as they want as long as you keep them on the hook with information. And so engagement means I'm paying attention, I'm wanting more. So if in your presentation you say, if this is piquing your interest, this maybe it's a specific thing. If this part's piquing your interest, here's a little web page you can go. We've got a video and a short article, and we've got the actual documents that we presented that you can read. And that's kind of like giving them permission to geek out. But you can do that and slowly give that out over time. I think that's a really good way to be able to increase their engagement. Another way, which I like and I don't like, is for really asking for the public to get involved and like speak and that sort of thing. There are dangers that go along with that, of course, as you're aware.
Yes, anytime you hand a microphone over to someone, it's a giant risk. So speaking of geeking out, there have been a couple questions in a couple places about having access to these slides. Tom, I believe you'll be sharing these in the Whova app, so people will be able to get to the slide decks for all the presenters who share their slides. And most presenters are holding on to their slide decks until after their presentations, so as to prevent reading ahead. So I'll just make note of that. And if Tom, if you could speak to this real briefly, I'm going to take this as an opportunity for a little bit of self-promotion for you on your Thursday session about the APR, because somebody asked about the tangible benefits of the APR accreditation, which there's a full breakout session on that on Thursday. Do you want to give a 30-second plug for that?
Yeah, absolutely, Isaiah. And I will tell you that getting my APR was the best decision I made in my professional life, in my entire career. It gave me understanding of things that I was already doing and helped me to do them better. And it gave me just a universe of stuff that I didn't even know about that vastly improved my effectiveness as a communications professional, and really helped me when I changed leaders in the last year to a leader that didn't understand public relations. And I was able to, using what I learned in the APR, to effectively explain why it was we wanted to do audience research, or why we had a particular strategy and why we didn't just use tactics. It is a lot of work, but every time I read a page in the book, I had to stop because I went, oh my goodness, I want to implement that right away with my team. So highly, highly worth it. I encourage any communications professional to go for your APR.
Okay, and we have probably enough time for just one last item here, and I think this one's interesting. It's relating back to the Lord of the Rings campaign and the use of Gollum. There was a question about copyright for that.
Yeah,
Did you have
sure,
to
you bet.
obtain permission? How do you approach
No, we didn't have to obtain permission. It's a fair use. It's would come under the category of like a humorist taking a humorous look at something. Satire, for instance, is one of the acceptable uses for copyright. We actually did have our Department of Justice attorneys look at this, and they said, no, that clearly falls into this category. You don't need to ask permission. Now, if the makers of Lord of the Rings had said, hey, don't use that, then we wouldn't have used it. But yeah, we didn't have any problems with that. We're continuing to do that, in fact. And we use others. We use other known pieces of literature as well.
Okay.
So you can go to our our channel there at Oregon DOT on Twitter, and you can see some of those.
Great. Well, thank you, Tom. I appreciate your time. I'm sure I speak for many who do appreciate this presentation. So for everyone, thank you for attending, and you have a little break before our next sessions get underway. So enjoy your afternoon or late morning, depending on where you are.
All right, take
Thank
care,
you.
everybody. And yes, I am putting these up on Whova, so you'll be able to get them. Take care.
Thanks again, Tom.